In pop culture these days, there is a way to express when something is really terrible. You can do it verbally or in writing. Either way, it's usually a little tongue in cheek, meant as intentional exaggeration. The expression is to write worst, period, and then whatever was the worst. So let's say you had a really bad breakfast. So you'd say breakfast, period, and then the word ever, period. So put it all together, worst breakfast ever. Now, I don't know when it started, but it was popularized by the Simpsons cartoon because one of the characters in that cartoon, comic book guy, likes to use the expression. One episode that features comic book guy is called Worst Episode Ever. And because I can't resist, let's watch a supercut of comic book guy using this expression.
Worst couch gag ever. You are about to see the worst half hour of television ever.
Young man, you've had what we call a cardiac episode.
Worst episode ever.
Oh, not even close.
The worst episode ever. Worst episode ever. Worst parents ever. Worst cosmic wars ever. Worst crossover ever. Worst reading ever. Worst jammed in movie parody ever. The worst movie ever! And send and sip. Worst ending ever.
Oh, I probably like that too much. So, in our story today, Jesus says that if Simon, James, and John follow him, he will make them fishers of men, or as more accurately translated in our reading, I will make you fish for people. I think that is the worst metaphor ever. Now, before I criticize the metaphor too much, I should say that the spirit of the comparison is clear enough. Jesus wants these new disciples to leave their work as fishermen who make a living by bringing fish into their boat and instead go out and seek people to bring into the church. So maybe go where the people are, the way you go where the fish are, maybe use a little bait to entice the people in, cast your nets wide, pulling people in without discrimination or prejudice. Okay, fine, that's the big idea. But why does Jesus have to compare such efforts to share God's love to fish who are being violently dragged out of their natural habitat, tortured, slaughtered, and eaten? Yes, all metaphors can be taken too far, but this particular metaphor goes too far really fast. And history does bear this out. Over centuries, how quickly has the church taken this metaphor that far, showing little regard for the well-being of people as long as they are present on Sunday morning in the church and giving money, prioritizing a large congregation over loving people well, and in some cases, harming people once they have been hauled into the church. So we could say it's just a harmless metaphor, but it hasn't been completely harmless. Well, this summer, I'm going to be taking a sabbatical, and I will use the sabbatical to work on a book that I've been thinking about for a long time. The working title is A Vegan Reading of the Bible. And my thesis is that there are two central Bible passages, along with numerous secondary passages, that offer powerful testimony in support of a vegan lifestyle. That is, a life seeking to minimize our contribution to animal suffering and death. The first of the two central passages will be Genesis chapters 1 and 2, in which Adam and Eve are commanded to eat only plants, to be caregivers of the earth and all its creatures, and all the animals of the earth are created by God as companions to humans and not as food. The second central passage, and the one I want to spend some time on today, will be the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, in which Jesus explains that the greatest commandments, to love God and love neighbor, really come down to how well we show mercy to those who are suffering. We love our neighbor by showing mercy. We love our neighbor by using our power to help when they have less power. Cultivating and maximizing the virtues of mercy and compassion within ourselves is far more important to Jesus than determining who is worthy of that mercy. Now, in addition to those two core passages, I'll also have in the book, I'll have to deal with many passages in the Bible that are antithetical to these ideas. Verses and stories that assume animals are either objects to be sacrificed to God or used to produce food or simply eaten themselves. Now, to address those passages, I'll be suggesting that such ideas are really peripheral to the core teachings of the Bible and should be read critically in light of more foundational passages. Using core passages to critique peripheral passages is similar to what we do when we read the Bible when it assumes other problematic things, such as slavery as an unchallenged institution or women as subordinate to men. We've learned to critique passages that support such fundamental injustice. So in the book, I'll make a similar argument by saying we must use more foundational passages to critique texts that assume animals are here to be used by human beings in any way we wish. So today's passage, I think, is a perfect example of a story that requires this kind of critique. No one in this story has any concern for the well-being of the fish. The fish in the story are completely disregarded. It's assumed that as non-human and less powerful creatures, they can be used as props and that their suffering can be mostly disregarded in service to the message. Significantly, we also can see this kind of lack of regard for the life and well-being of the fish being translated historically to a lack of regard for those who are supposed to be caught by the Christians in the name of Jesus. The lack of value given to the well-being of the fish has had these real-life consequences. For instance, if someone is happily and faithfully swimming along in the Jewish faith, following God's law, saying their prayers, going to synagogue, some Christians will say, but they don't believe in Jesus. Let's hook that person in the mouth and drag them into the church. That's what we do to fish. Let's do it to people too. If someone's living a good life as an atheist, adhering to ethical humanist principles and loving their family and their neighbors, doesn't matter how they're living, throw a net over that person and drag them into the church, flailing and fighting if necessary. That's what we do to fish. Let's do it to people too. If someone is crying out, I can't breathe because institutions and systems that should protect me are killing me, we walk away, just as Jesus, Peter, James, and John walked away from that miraculous catch of fish, leaving them to suffocate and be slaughtered on the shore. They were more concerned about furthering their ministry than about the life and suffering they had caused. So that's an example of a vegan critique of the Bible. Now, I bet suggesting that the Bible calls us to veganism makes some people uncomfortable. Probably more uncomfortable even than hearing me talk about the biblical witness to racial justice or gender justice or economic justice. Now, maybe not. Maybe as a vegan, I'm extra sensitive. For instance, I've learned to be very careful what I say when sharing a meal with other people. If the table conversation turns to my diet, it's very hard to explain the ethical reasons for being vegan while the other people at the table are taking a bite out of their hamburger. Nothing ruins the mood at dinner like a description of the environmental devastation caused by animal agriculture, baby cows being separated from their mother so we can have her milk, or the inner workings of a slaughterhouse. Thanks for inviting me to lunch, everybody. Suggesting that there is something wrong with the way people eat is just very touchy. And I understand why. Using animals for human benefit, especially eating animals, it's profoundly ingrained in our culture and our identity. Food is intricately intertwined with our memories of childhood, our feelings of safety and being cared for, our cultural identity, gender identity, and racial identity. For most of us, those core memories of food from our childhood involved eating animals. This means our food choices are not going to be rational. What we eat is intertwined with our emotions, our culture, and our identity. Think about men being the ones who are supposed to operate the grill and cook the meat. Soul food is part of the African American culture. The expectation at important holiday meals that certain meats must be on the table. And just the smell of certain foods that can cause cherished memories of childhood to come flooding back. On top of that, what we eat is not something we choose just every so often, but multiple times a day. So suggesting that there is something wrong with our food choices can be very touchy. In other words, when I preach about eliminating meat and animal products from our diet, I'm not just preaching, I'm meddling. And yet, isn't that what Jesus did? Jesus didn't just preach, he meddled. He challenged us to the core of our very identity. He said, all who want to be my followers must deny themselves, deny any part of your identity that it's not grounded in compassion and mercy. He said, if you want to save your life, you must lose the way you are currently living. According to Jesus, no other part of our identity is more important than how we love God and neighbor by practicing mercy, by using our power to help others and alleviate suffering. I know it's expanding the boundaries of mercy and compassion to suggest we should show the same mercy to an animal that we show to a person. But Jesus was all about expanding those boundaries too. When people put lepers outside the bounds of mercy, Jesus expanded the boundary to include them. When people put the disabled outside the bounds of mercy, Jesus expanded the boundary to include them. When people put Samaritans or Gentiles or women outside the bounds of love, Jesus expanded the boundaries to include them. So are we then supposed to stop expanding the boundaries of our love and mercy because Jesus did not cover a particular category in his lifetime? Or was he setting an example of boundary expansion for us to carry even further? He did say, you will do even greater things than I have done. Charles Darwin put it this way: humanity toward inferior animals is one of the noblest virtues with which man is endowed, and it is part of the final stage of the development of moral sentiments. It is only when we become concerned for the totality of sentient beings that our morality attains its highest level. One thing that makes me particularly nervous about the way we treat animals in our society is how easy it is to deny a person basic justice and dignity by classifying that person as an animal or saying those people are just like animals. Whenever one group of people wants something from another group of people, the aggressor classifies the victim as animals. Anytime we're fighting in a war, the way slave owners viewed African slaves in the South, our ability to put people in cages and separate families at the border. Because we treat animals poorly, it is far too easy to move people into that category when we want to justify treating them poorly too. We've already practiced harming and killing animals. Let's treat some people that way too. Because we're so bad at deciding who is worthy of mercy and who is not, Jesus in the parable of the Good Samaritan tells us to stop deciding. He tells the story because someone asked him, Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who do I have to love? Who can I leave out of the circle of mercy? Who can I walk by on the road without helping? Jesus then tells the story of the Good Samaritan and ends by asking, so which of the men who saw the suffering person on the side of the road was a neighbor to him? His questioner replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, that's the answer to your question. Don't try to figure out who is a neighbor and who is not, but act like a neighbor to all. A neighbor practices mercy to all who suffer. Stop drawing circles that exclude some from this requirement. Start expanding your capacity for compassion. Start expanding your capacity for mercy. There's no line where our mercy and compassion should stop. Now I know our reading this morning is not at all about being vegan. It's the opposite. It's a story about how a lot of fish that are killed in order to show us the way we're supposed to share God's love with the world. But sometimes, as I said, some Bible readings must be critiqued in the light of more foundational passages. To that end, let's use our imaginations a little. Let's use our imaginations to rewrite our story in a way that helps us see how we might treat people better if we treated animals better. What if we imagine Peter, James, and John had dedicated their lives to treating animals with kindness and mercy? Then the metaphor would have a whole different meaning. Imagine a story in which Peter, James, and John have dedicated their lives to caring for the ecosystem of the Sea of Galilee, and protecting its creatures from harm because they saw the fish and the birds and all the animals of the ecosystem as wonders and treasures of God's creation. Imagine they were professional stewards of the Sea of Galilee and protectors of its creatures. If that were the case, Jesus would be saying, hey guys, come follow me, and I'll show you how to treat people as God's precious creation too. Best metaphor ever. Some might object that imagining such a thing is ridiculous and impossible because people of the time had to fish in order to survive. And maybe so. And you can't change the story beyond the reality, some might say. But remember, the Bible doesn't hesitate to imagine a world that may seem completely impossible and even ridiculous to us today. Just think of Isaiah chapter 11. The wolf shall lie down with the lamb, the leopard and the kid shall lie down together, the calf and the fatling and the lion, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like an ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Not only can we imagine a radically different world, but we must. Where would we be today if faithful people in the past refused to use their imaginations to envision something radically better than life in biblical times? Now, I don't expect everyone to become vegan as a result of hearing this sermon. Now, of course, if you would like some resources and advice, I'd be happy to help you. But I know this stuff is deeply ingrained in who we are, and change doesn't happen overnight, even if you're convinced that change is needed. But I do hope that everyone will think more intentionally about what it would mean to be merciful to all living things. What would it mean to use our power to protect and save life instead of taking life for our own purposes? What would it mean to stop deciding which living things deserve our compassion and mercy and which do not? What would it mean to shower mercy and compassion on all God's creatures? And what would it mean if we treated animals with such dignity and compassion that treating a person like an animal was actually a good thing? Amen.